Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Biochar Expo 2025 webinar and podcast series session, proudly hosted by ANZBIG, the Australian New Zealand Biochar Industry Group. Our focus today is biochar's potential in carbon markets, which examines the commercialisation of biochar and its growing role as a carbon removal solution. Over the past 2 years, biochar has accounted for an average of around 85% of all durable carbon dioxide removal, CDR, credits sold in the voluntary market worldwide. That figure highlights the trust in biochar as a scalable, permanent and impactful CDR pathway, and the beauty of biochar that differentiates itself from other CDR methods such as direct air capture or DAC and bioenergy carbon capture and storage BECCS, as we've highlighted in our 2 previous webinars on biochar compost and biochar and water management, are the benefits, return on investment and case studies that proves biochar works when it's made and applied as a fit-for-purpose commodity. So we're joined today by 4 outstanding speakers. Matthew Warnken, former chair of Soil Carbon Industry Group and director at AgriProve. Renee Velasquez, managing partner at Valaterra. Vivek Duggar, director at WEAC, and Abraham Robertson, CEO and founder of Biochar, who are the project managers for one of the largest biochar projects worldwide on Kangaroo Island. So welcome to all of our speakers today. If you're working on policy, project development, agribusiness or sustainability, this conversation will provide valuable insights into market trends, credit generation, and the business models underpinning biochar's rise. The webinar is scheduled to run for an hour and a half, so please put your questions in the Q&A panel and we will come to those in the last 30 minutes. Also, look out for comments in the chat as well. Not a member of ANZBIG yet? Now's a great time to join and be part of the movement shaping the future of biochar across Australasia and beyond. Visit anzbig.org for more information on the various levels, benefits and fee structures. The more members united on this front, the louder our voice will be. Biochar is more than a product, it is a movement. I'm joined today by our chair, Melissa Rebick from Metamorph Engineering, who are kicking goals with various projects popping up in both Australia and New Zealand, featuring their charset technology. So welcome, Melissa. And then also facilitating today's discussion is Dr. Adam O'Toole from Soil Sequest and chair of our Standards and Certification Working Group. So thanks, Adam, and look forward to the discussion. Also, thanks to assistance from team members Sean Scallon at Sustainability Plus, and he's with the Victorian Bioenergy Network, and chair of our Supply and Market Development Working Group. Thank you, Sean. As well as Dr. Tim Charlton from XMET Proprietary Limited, chair of our Education and Communications Working Group. So they can also assist in the chat with any queries you have, and we'll be sharing other relevant information throughout the event. So I'd now like to hand over to Melissa to say a few words on behalf of ANZBIG, and then over to Adam to introduce yourself and start the discussion.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to all of our speakers and attendees. It's such an important topic to be here and listening to. ANZBIG has a roadmap that aims to pyrolyse 50 million metric tonnes of available biomass into biochar in Australia and New Zealand. Recent paper coming out by Wen and Annette Cowie says that can mitigate by pyrolysing that 50 million metric tonnes. It can mitigate 10 to 30% of Australia's greenhouse emissions. The paper just covers off on 2 elements of carbon. So one is by pyrolysing waste biomass and trapping the carbon in that biochar. It's highly measurable and tradable and can be traded across a whole range of markets globally, and I know our speakers will touch on that. The other side of it, which we may not touch on as much, is the renewable energy side or renewable fuels, and that that is part of that. So there's emission avoidance plus the actual carbon dioxide removal from making biochar, and the emission avoidance when you make biochar to produce this renewable energy or renewable fuels. They're two elements, but then there's the whole side of actually using the biochar as well. And to touch on a few, I know some of our speakers will go deeper into this, is when you use biochar in the soil, the priming effect of building soil carbon. And then when you apply it to other things, you can reduce methane by feeding it through animals or by adding it to landfill, and also nitrous oxide reductions, for example, by adding it to fertilizers. So that's to name a few. So there's a whole range of, we're talking 10 to 30% just by making biochar, but then there's a whole range of other opportunities that range of papers started to cover off on, and we're going to uncover today. And I really thank the speakers for being part of that, because it all shapes our direction in terms of how we roll out this roadmap. So I won't say much more. I'll hand it over to the speakers, to you, Adam, to facilitate. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa, and welcome to everyone from around the world who's listening to the webinar today. My name's Dr. Adam O'Toole. I have a background in research in agronomy and also in biochar. I work currently at Soil Sequest as a research agronomist, where we do, among other things, field trials with different methods for storing carbon in soil, which biochar is certainly one of those. And we're welcoming today our four panelists who have expertise both in the biochar industry, the soil carbon industry, which is well and active in Australia, and also the global carbon markets. So hopefully by the end of this webinar, we'll have a greater understanding of how biochar fits into carbon markets, and also the opportunities which are coming forward. I'd first like, just to get started, I'd like to first ask my question to Abe Robertson, CEO of Biochar. Abe, you're doing lots of biochar projects at the moment, and you've got the big Kangaroo Island project underway. We read from your website that Biochar has a goal of removing 1 million tonnes per annum by 2030, and we see you're well underway towards that goal. Can you tell us more about how carbon markets will help you reach that goal?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Don, Melissa. Nice to see you all here. Hello, other panelists. Thanks for the first question, Adam. As you mentioned, Biochar is an engineering firm. We're focused on large-scale deployment of pyrolysis units, and in that we've become a project developer. So we're sort of supporting mainly through joint ventures projects around the world, and we're very fortunate to be working on the Kangaroo Island projects, which some of you may have read about. That project's being funded by Revi, which is a subsidiary out of Kyland, which was an ASX listed company, and we're processing the burnt timber from the terrible bushfires that wreaked havoc on the island down there. So it's an amazing project. It's first of a kind deployment of a very large pyrolysis units, and so we're very excited to work through commissioning as we are at the moment. In terms of like where we're focused, there's lots of different amazing biochar projects, everything from Kentikis to sort of the large engineered solutions that we do. They're all beautiful, they're all amazing, they all have their place. We're very much focused on that large end, Adam, and with that we would only need sort of 10, 15 projects in the order of magnitude of Kangaroo Island to reach that goal of 1 million plus. So at the low side, I think Kangaroo Island at full scale, and we've done 25% of the deployment, will generate in order of sort of 170,000 CDR a year, 160 to 170,000. So it's quite a large project, but small in the grand scheme of things. I think just yesterday I heard a quote that the average voluntary carbon market project actually generates around 1 million units in like nature or otherwise. So these are relatively small volumes, but as we'll talk about, I'm sure, they trade at relatively high prices compared to others in the market, but at a very reasonable price, fair price, we would say, and we can talk to that. But Bike is focused on larger projects. We have projects in Argentina, Sri Lanka. We commissioned a site in Vietnam in the Dong Thap Mekong region, doing rice husk just a couple of weeks ago. We're looking at projects in America, and we've got a number in Australia as well. So I think we're well on our way, Adam. We're hoping carbon pricing can help get us there. I'm sure we'll talk to that.
Right. And we'll be circling back to you shortly, Abe. We'll just introduce the other speakers as well before we get more into a collaborative discussion. I'd like to bring my attention to Matthew. Matthew, you've been a pioneer in the soil carbon industry in Australia. You founded Corporate Carbon and later AgriProve, which are leading the way in soil carbon projects in Australia. You've also had a little bit of history with biochar. Can you give us a little bit of insight into where you see biochar in the broader sort of soil carbon market, and what's pricking your interest about biochar now going forward?
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here on the panel. So look, I'm always looking for scalable opportunities to either avoid emissions at large scale or remove huge amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. Hence the interest in soil carbon, where we can take carbon out of the atmosphere where it's a problem and put it into the soil where it is a fundamental solution. A fundamental value proposition in terms of increasing the function of soils. And biochar is very, very similar in terms of that innovation opportunity to do something very different and in a way incorporate sort of ecology into our economy. So climate change in a way is a symptom of a global economy that's out of sync with the ecology of the planet. Biochar becomes a balancing act in terms of how that can be remedied. Often said, there's no such thing as silver bullets, which you can't argue with, but there is silver buckshot. So soil carbon, biochar, all of these great innovations are very much in that category of silver buckshot. So to me, then, what I find fascinating is how do you unlock the funding model? Where is the funding model to unlock that innovation at speed and scale that makes it material to our climate? So great to see the progress that Abe's making. Carbon markets, in my view, play a fundamental role in unlocking that innovation. And in getting those demonstration projects up, getting things working, providing that funding opportunities to mobilize the amounts of capital that we need to make a difference. So with my various hats on, obviously looking at ways to scale soil carbon projects. With Corporate Carbon, we're now actually, I think, the first carbon project developer in the world that has a cattle herd. So we've got 15,000 head of cattle that's running on our land, central Queensland up to Cape York and the Northern Territory. So then that makes the theory of biochar as improving quality of soil, not just theoretical, but material. And the opportunities to use biochar as feeding supplements into cattle. From a productivity improvement, and then also as a means of distributing biochar throughout some of our vast landscapes. So that's certainly what I've looking at through that lens of innovation. How does carbon markets unlock those funding opportunities, and more than just theory in that day to day we are looking at how do we actually improve landscapes, how do we improve productivity. And make that innovation count from a practical perspective.
Thanks for that great insights there, Matthew. We'll just briefly we'll cover the other panelists first, and then we'll get back into a more general discussion. Like to give the floor to Renee, speaking from Singapore. Renee, we've had a short chat, and I understand you're well experienced in the global carbon markets. Would you give us a brief introduction to the work you've done over the last decade, and what you're hearing among maybe institutional investors around biochar on more of a sort of global level?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Adam, for the invite, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel. By no means I do purport to be a biochar expert, but happy to give you that sort of broad context around what we're seeing in markets. I'll give you the Bridge Notes version, but I spent a decade at a company that's now called Expansive, where I led the carbon markets business globally, and really enjoyable experience. That's where Abe and I actually worked together back in the day. And Expansive today is the infrastructure provider within the broader environmental commodity markets. So now kind of bring it to the biochar question, what we're seeing from institutional investors and that's kind of the broader market. To piggyback on what Abe said, biochar is in this unique position of high integrity, long durability, high quality CDR pathways that can actually achieve scale and can do so at a relatively attractive cost, right? And it's all relative because within the broader context, the voluntary carbon market and the instruments that are trading in there that are project-based, and as Abe mentioned, coming from predominantly from nature-based sources, there are cook-stove credits, renewables, and other more exotic beasts, let's just say. On the more ubiquitous type of credits, the prices are fairly depressed. I think it's fair to say when we look at the standardized instruments that we launched during my time at Expansive, that are now tradable across futures complexes across CME, in particular the GEO and the NGO contracts, we see that they're trading near all-time lows, and that's a factor of essentially decreased liquidity within the broader system, and that's a result of less trust with regards to the standards that are effectively governing the market and the effective overcrediting risk that essentially nature-based solutions pose. As a result of that lack of trust, corporates have effectively retreated en masse from the secondary market. And so what we have is a tale of two markets. You've got the primary market, which is actually thriving and in which CDR is really heavily represented, and then a secondary market that is essentially constrained by the lack of that demand. What that leads to is essentially this huge sort of delta between the prices. And as long as that remains, effectively investment in the sector will remain to be constrained. But biochar is essentially one of the leading lights. And I'd point to some of the large transactions that have been done in the primary market as sort of examples of that. And most notably, Google made a sort of a very large and significant purchase earlier in the year of CDR coming from biochar, and to kind of piggyback off Abe's point, it's a large transaction, but in the context of CDR, it's 200,000 tons of removals, and those came from other firms, Varaha and Charm in particular. Those are large deals, and given the notional value of those transactions, are significant. But in the broader context, where we're talking hundreds of millions or tens of millions or even millions per project, it is still it's sort of relatively small within a volumetric context, but it's reflective of the kind of the early stage that CDR industry finds itself in. So hopefully that provides you some color, but also hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Renee. That's a nice overview. And finally, our fourth panelist is Vivek Dugar from We Act, and Vivek also has a long history in carbon markets and is doing biochar projects in India. Vivek, can you give us a little intro to your work and maybe some of the highlights of the work of biochar in India and how you're connecting farmers to carbon markets? You're on mute, Vivek. Just click off that one. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Adam, for the small introduction. Can everyone hear me, or Adam can, yeah, loud and clear? And thank you to the Biochar Association for inviting us on the panel as well. I think as a company, we have been studying biochar since 2017 onwards, and it actually came around when we were approached by MNRE, which is the Ministry of Natural Resources in India, on the waste issue on ag lands. So India is sort of unique in that sense. It has mostly small land holdings, unlike Australia, where you have a farm which is 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 hectares. It's very small land holdings, 1 to 10 hectares. And the ag waste that the country sort of produces per annum is roughly 550 million tons. And this is across various different crops. And I'm sure we all have heard at some point in news about the burning of, land in and around capital cities in India, which is quite a common practice in other parts of the world as well. But it's just such a vast area that it gets highlighted, and the pollution and the effects of that are quite visible. So we started on this journey in 2021 after sort of COVID restrictions was slightly a bit better, and we established a factory in the southern part of India, close to Hyderabad, where we have an office, and work with farmers. And the idea is that the waste that the farmers are actually burning right now, we take it, we bring it to our site. We use sort of not Contiki, but other sort of low-tech methods. We've improvised a lot of that, and we're kind of making catchment areas for the waste. And we process that, and we give the biochar back, a portion of the biochar back through the farmers so that they can apply on their land. We work with a lot of NGOs within the region who give them training on this. So, the initial uptake was very difficult because, as we all know, farmers are not, willing to change their practices. But we've seen a big impact in the last 12 months, when the farmers realize that their produce is, it's going up by almost 30%. There is a reduction in the use of their NPKs as well, and we're monitoring a lot of that. So I suppose our journey is there. We're using carbon. Obviously, we are registering our project under Vera, and we want to utilize carbon as a catalyst for bringing large-scale change. Kind of similar approach that we had taken in renewables back in 2007-8, when we did the world's largest wind farm, community-owned wind farm project of 2,200 megawatts. Each windmill was owned by an individual across a land area, and that transformed the region. So we and also transformed the grid of India, where 2005-6 it was 6 megawatts of renewables. Through carbon today, we are approaching 30 gigawatts of renewables. So that's how carbon transforms, an economy, and we want to use sort of that similar experience of renewables into biochar and see how we can scale it. Means I fully agree with all our panelists that how carbon can actually play a role, and from Matthew's view, how it can be scaled. I think these are important for the biochar methodology is quite important, not just from a carbon perspective, but from actually land and rejuvenation of land perspective as well. So that's the kind of work we're doing right now. Very, very ground level. One of our directors is almost sort of living on the farm now. And that's the approach we are taking as a company.
Thank you.
So that's
thank you, Vivek. Yeah, that's excellent work. And you touched on a few central benefits of biochar in Indian soils and crops, crop yield increases, reduction in smoke and emissions for the cities. I have definitely heard of that. Just an open question now to 4 panelists. Given that there's some, extra benefits around biochar, it's not just carbon sequestration, there's soil benefits, there's potentially other greenhouse gas reduction benefits with biochar. What are the investors and potential buyers of biochar credits looking at from a holistic perspective? Are they taking those co-benefits into consideration? Are biochar projects attractive to them? who would like to answer that question?
Happy to jump in, and then I'm sure Renee's got some comments on it.
Happy to take it after you, Abe.
Sure, maybe I can answer some of the questions that are popping up from the audience. Firstly, why aren't Australians as active in purchasing CDR credits? At the moment, you may have mentioned, Don mentioned 85% of biochar credits have been provided by biochar, but that's 85% of delivered units. In terms of the contracted forward sale, it's an order of magnitude greater than that. So what we're seeing is a lot of forward activity, people buying very long and then and setting a position, which enables the financing of these larger projects, in particular DAX, enhanced rock weathering, and biochar. So biochar is certainly the most technology ready. It's delivering and it's got opportunity to scale up. And that's why, Adam, to your question, why people like it, why Australian companies aren't as active at the moment. I think once you have a compliance market, it does sort of take the pressure off industry to some degree. Like the view then becomes that the government has acted, they've put in place safeguard mechanism, and therefore there's a scheme in place to ensure that Australia is doing its part to meet its NDCs and achieve its results. And so I think once there is a compliance scheme in place in a country, there becomes an onus on new methodologies, new pathways to become recognised under that. And so myself and others in the community, we all worked together. It was a very collaborative effort, and thanks to everyone who's involved, put forward an ACCU biochar method so that we could generate Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs, and have it integrated into the safeguard mechanism. My hope, and there's going to be a bit of philosophy on this call, no doubt, is that there's a bifurcation of the safeguard liability. So very similar to what happened in the renewable energy target, where we had a requirement to purchase large generation units from like wind farms, and then also to purchase small scale technology certificates from solar installations. And that really was I think Renee was involved in this as well. I was certainly involved in financing solar panels. That set the market alight. That bifurcation of the renewable energy target was one of the big reasons behind why solar penetration in Australia is so high. So I think what we're hoping for as an industry is ACCU method, bifurcation, set targets for removals and engineered removals in particular. That lines up with the Climate Change Authority has said, what IPCC has said, and I would argue what Oxford Principles and SBTI is moving towards. So maybe that's a little bit, is like, we think in Australia, for there to be a significant buyer demand, we're going to need to see an ACCU method. That said, for voluntary purchases, we've got Climate Active, and someone else can make comments about that, but I think that scheme does need ongoing review. And internationally, we're waiting for stronger signals from SBTI on how companies with a net zero ambition can use offsets in their scope 3 and offsets to neutralize residual emissions or historic emissions. That clarity should come in due course. There's a consultation out there at the moment, so I encourage anyone who's interested to jump onto SBTI and have a look at that. So I just want to cover some of those base things for you, Adam. Maybe Renee, I don't know if you want to jump in.
Yeah, no, happy to. Thanks, Abe, for that context. And obviously within the lens of Australia, I couldn't agree more. Sort of just to add on in terms of back to Adam's question around what are the buyers looking for. Certainly, these co-benefits, let's call them, right, are really, really important. And I would add biodiversity as well to that mix, subject to the use cases. But it comes down to the question of who's willing to pay the premium, right? And then ultimately the other question is, what is the demand driver? Within the pure voluntary context, we've got this paradox around voluntary participation not being enough for some folks, let's say those on the left, right? And then those on the right being too much and being too woke. And essentially, there's another paradox, which is essentially if this voluntary participation doesn't seem to have an implicit reward or a recognition, to Abe's point around the SBTI component. And most corporates, and this also applies to institutional investors as well, but on the corporate demand side, they're hesitant to really make big investments in this current economic landscape right now, unless there's a clear incentive for them to participate. So the default is, as Abe said, we need clear policy guidance to create a much stickier sort of demand driver, and that will certainly be localized. And so, Abe's giving you that Australian context, but I think that we'll start to see more and more fungibility across different markets as we start to see this integration between the voluntary or the project-based approaches and this intersection that we now have under the Paris Agreement. And I certainly think that CDR is certainly much more likely to be included in an SBTI pathway with regards to those residual emissions, certainly at the net zero date, but it's those unavoided emissions that are occurring throughout that time piece or period, I should say, that really need to be abated, or in this context, those emissions need to be removed. And so once we have those demand drivers emerge, and they could come from as disparate sources as CORSIA, another compliance mechanism that deals with regards to the capping of emissions within international aviation, then we start to see flows essentially of supply entering into those markets, and we start to see more and more competition, and hopefully that then begets a higher base sort of price, and then that supports more and more investment theses, because that's I guess the rate limiting step right now. The bankability of a lot of these projects is dependent on the quality of the off takers, and so it's a little bit of a chasm to cross. Hopefully, some context. Happy for Matt and for Vivek to jump in.
Maybe just to add to that too, just to talking about sort of carbon markets in raising the issue of confidence and also compliance. So I think, Renee, you mentioned, and we're living through it, that sort of liquidity crunch in the global carbon markets that arose from a lack of confidence. But really, it was kind of like a confected lack of confidence, in my view, around nature-based solutions, because we lost sight of the strategic imperative of the urgency and necessity of these kind of solutions at scale. In my mind, too, it also showed the flaws, the structural flaws in a voluntary carbon market, in that you don't have government-backed carbon units. You've got essentially a company backing those. Now, what that means is that projects bear a whole raft of the risk around the credit and the credit issuance, and that risk can be potentially a legacy risk and backdated, which then leads to a whole raft of issues in terms of lack of confidence in terms of investors putting their capital to play in the voluntary markets. The plus side, in terms of the Australian local market, we do have a regulated market. The downside of our market is we're in the Southern Hemisphere. Just came back from 6 months abroad, and pretty much Australia is invisible. So like, no one knows that we've got a carbon market, let alone a regulated market, let alone increasing demand under the safeguard mechanism. And a lot of people who were like sort of wringing their hands are looking at their nature-based portfolios in the voluntary carbon markets. If they had hedged with some exposure in our regulatory space, actually those the regulatory projects would be carrying the day for them. So again, from my view, importance of a regulated market becomes fundamental to attracting long-term capital and getting that confidence in terms of those investments. The downside potentially in terms of regulated markets is we will converge at a commodity price. So it's an interesting observation, Abe. I hadn't quite heard that pitch in the carbon market, so I was splitting STCs versus LGCs. So there could be a merit in that in a further discussion, but invariably that commodity regulatory market will converge at a price. And interestingly, coming back from Baku and in a post-Baku sort of Article 6 world, again, I see the pluses side of that is getting to more compliance, government-backed issuance of credits, government staying behind those credits, so avoiding those pitfalls in the voluntary market, does lead to then convergence around price, which then, in terms of paying for the premium, I think we will see carbon credits being the commodity, and actually getting certification in terms of, if you want to do biodiversity, don't do biodiversity plus your carbon, do them as separate. So if you want, investors want to pay for biodiversity, is a biodiversity certification scheme. If you want to buy, pay for clean water, pay for clean water. If you want to buy indigenous core benefits, pay for those, but pay for those separately to the actual carbon. So still a lot of work to do, and confidence, a lot of work to do in terms of establishing the confidence. I think we can all potentially benefit each project in the carbon market by not trying to say too much that how great our brand of carbon is compared to everyone else. It sounds like a bit of an ecumenical service, but like all carbon projects are great, all carbon credits are great. And maybe even coming back to the fundamentals, economics 101 of a carbon credit, especially if anyone purchased a carbon credit on a voluntary basis. A lot of the detractors around those nature-based system projects are really ideologically opposed to the use of carbon credits by oil and gas industries, and then potentially that use of those carbon credits prolonging the life of those oil and gas industries. There is a philosophical debate that we might get to depending as to where we get to Abe's. Didn't know that you studied philosophy as an undergrad. But the point being, if you buy a carbon credit, you are putting voluntarily a price on the carbon intensity of your production. So I've never heard anyone's, generalizing, but anyone on the left saying that a carbon tax is not a good thing. A carbon tax works by increasing the cost of your production according to its carbon intensity. Now, the use of that money is irrelevant because it just works to increase the cost of supply. So a carbon credit, when an oil and gas company purchases a carbon credit, they are increasing the cost of the carbon intensity of their production. In a way, it doesn't matter where those funds go to or what they buy. The double dividend of buying a carbon credit is that funding model for innovation, because we are not going to solve the climate challenge by doing the same thing over and over again. We need new products, new services, new technological innovations. They need to be funded. So enter carbon credits. And that, I think, what is missing from the overall debate. One, all carbon projects are great. Carbon credits, they work because they increase the cost of the intensity of the carbon by the purchaser of those carbon credit. And two, they fund the necessary innovation that we need to be able to break through and solve this climate conundrum. So in a way, to improve that confidence, it is getting back to basics in terms of the underlying fundamentals of carbon credits, carbon markets, why they're so great, and really building back that confidence in the capital markets to be able to deploy at scale.
Thanks, Matthew. That's great. I'd like to bring Vivek back into the discussion, and when we talk about making biochar and selling carbon credits, there's different ways you could do it. There's a centralized way where you bring biomass to a centralized facility, and there's a more decentralized model where you're making the biochar closer to where it's probably used, in the example that Vivek gave. Vivek, obviously the logistics around a decentralized approach is very different to the centralized approach. Can you give us some insight into maybe some of the challenges or maybe innovation that you've developed along the way to meet the challenges of a decentralized biochar approach?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. I think in terms of the logistics is a big challenge, because you're really it's a dry weight that you are sort of taking around. For now, I think the way we are sort of operating is to keep a limited circumference or limited diameter of our catchment, like not go beyond a certain point, because otherwise the cost of logistics is just way too much. I mean, there's innovation that can be done in terms of trucking it, in terms of managing it, and then a lot of that is available around the world. But the main part is there's a certain catchment, and you just stick to that catchment. And the moment you start to expand that, and that's just not going to work from cost perspective. That's probably the only thing I can actually contribute. Coming to the last point, actually, I just want to add one more thing. I think all the points that you guys said on funding and scalability, on funding and voluntary markets for biochar projects, I think one key point is, even from an ACCU perspective, that the price that you see for biochar credits in the international markets, whether they're voluntary, whether they are sort of, or most of it is voluntary, or self-imposed compliance by companies, then that's that's quite different than the ACCU price, what is there today. And considering the safeguard mechanism entity credits that will start to come in, considering the other nature-based methods that will start to also generate ACCUs over a span of over the next sort of 5-7 years, it's actually difficult to say how will biochar from ACCU projects will compete in that space. That's just my observation. And then when it comes to international, I think there are clear signals in some sense that there are companies who are like, no, we want to invest in CDR and they're willing to pay the price. And I think those number of those companies internationally will tend to increase over the next 5-7 years. That's kind of the way we look at it. So that's kind of just our observation from an ACCU perspective and an international perspective. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Vivek. Obviously, you're referring there to a price differential between the voluntary market and the clients market, the ACCU. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the difference is about 5 or 6 times.
Right.
The difference. So the ACCU price is about 5 or 6 times less than what you would get for a biochar carbon credit. Correct. In the voluntary market. So just going back to you, Abe, we've now, as part of ANZBIG and others across industry working groups, submitted an ACCU expression of interest to the Australian government to get a biochar ACCU method going. Why is it important to have an ACCU method on biochar in your context and for Australian projects versus if you would go out into the voluntary market and get 5 or 6 times the price?
Yeah, sure. So, I agree with Matt's comment to begin with. We're trying to price an externality here. We're trying to encourage decarbonisation. I think the fundamental premise behind carbon markets is putting a price on carbon. And by putting a price on carbon, you encourage decarbonisation. If the price is too low, you go to market and you buy from low credits. You need a high price to encourage decarbonisation. And a high price comes from a confluence of supply and demand metrics and good policy. I think what we've seen is that I wouldn't anchor on the ACCU price at the moment. We're at the very early preliminary stages of an incredible piece of policy, the safeguard mechanism, which is putting a price on carbon in Australia. And we're going to see an expansion of actors in that space who are going to have to enter the scheme. And we're going to see tightening of thresholds for what liable exposed entities will have to cover for, either through decarbonisation or pricing. I think Australia has always been at the forefront of policy, whether it's water entitlements, whether it's renewable energy efficiency schemes in Australia. I mean, you go back to greenhouse gas abatement scheme. I think the only market that I understand that existed before that is Acid Rain Act over in America. We Australians are really very, very good at carbon markets, and we are. I'm in Nagoya, Japan at the moment. Renee's over in Singapore. We work together over in the US. You go anywhere in the world, Australians are there, and there's a reason for that. It's because we've got a deep experience in these markets. Don't anchor on the current price. Every carbon market is in contango. What I mean by that is the future price is higher than the current price, and that's because it's an inconvenience trade. You're only buying it because you're told to, unfortunately. That's the reality. It's a compliance market, and you tend to buy late. And those who really understand that buy forward to cover or hedge their risk of future exposure. We're going to see that price climb. And I think as that price climbs, you're going to see other technologies come into being viable. That includes biochar. We're going to keep pushing for that bifurcation. We would, as an industry, I think we should get behind that. I mean, we've seen what it did to solar. I think Australia's got incredible engineers, industry resources. We've got the land, we've got the biomass, we've got the ability to manufacture here, create jobs here. Add and enhance agriculture. There's so many benefits from biochar. It's a no-brainer. We're currently writing a letter to aspiring politicians, trying to raise a bit of awareness about biochar and ACCU. So anyone's interested, please reach out to ANZBIG and we'll add you as a signatory. But where it comes to that, so why would you go compliance and not voluntary? And it's very simple, finance. If we had an ACCU biochar methodology right now, I reckon I would have 4 projects financed within the next 6 months. And the reason for that is the ACCU compliance scheme has certainty, and therefore there's going to be buyers. We're going to argue for a premium price over the generic ACCU price for sure, and it's going to be interesting to see which liable entities get into that or who finances that. But I think there's precedence already for their higher prices being paid for what may be deemed a higher integrity or higher quality or higher durability. Lots of different reasons why there's a premium. Why would you sell into the voluntary market? You get a higher price. And if you go back to those co-benefits, what I'd prefer to talk about is project design. When you see lots of co-benefits associated with a project, what you're seeing there is a really well-designed project that's thinking about the environmental impact, thinking about the stakeholders. And if you think about that from a buyer's perspective, they're paying a premium for the reduced risk associated with that project. The more ingrained your project is, it's like, what's the biomass? Where did the source come? How is it certified? What's the technology? Is it engineered? Is it simplified? What's the logistics? What's the stakeholder engagement? What are the co-benefits? What's the impact you're having on your ecosystem? Like, where are you selling that biochar? What revenue streams are you getting? All of these things are way up to the due diligence process that a voluntary buyer does to ensure that their reputation integrity is not going to be put at risk, and they will pay a premium for that. They are mostly, though, paying a premium for the marginal cost to remove. So they're paying a higher price for the durability associated with biochar. And, I guess I'll refer to Microsoft calls it the medium durability, so a couple of 100 years to 1,000 years or more. There's a great argument going on in laboratories around the world about inertinite, and that there's a geological store for at least a pool of carbon within biochar. We agree with that, so we're hoping that gets adopted into registries and methodologies as we move forward, and therefore there may even be a higher price paid for that for that biochar. But they're ultimately paying a higher price or a premium, as I think Renee referred to it as, for the durability. They look for co-benefits because I think that really does represent good project design. And so if you're a developer out there and you're thinking about that narrative that you're putting forward to the buyer, think about that. Think about like all of those different things that a buyer would do if they're doing due diligence on a voluntary procurement, because they're making a voluntary procurement. They want to talk about it. They want to showcase it. They want to put it in board packs and their internal stakeholders. And the more benefits they can associate with the project, the more likely they're going to be able to get that support. Renee has been a world leader on this, and so he's probably the best person to talk to the complexities of pricing, I guess idiosyncratic risk in carbon markets. And while what compliance does, though, is provides that standardization or commoditization and makes it easy to finance a project.
Maybe I can piggyback on what Abe said. It seems like a pretty good two-punch combo here in terms of tandem responses. So thanks, Abe, and thanks for the shout out, but I don't consider myself that. So just to sort of add a little bit of comments to Abe, to Matthew, and to Vivek's in sort of insights, which are really incredible. I do think, let's put aside the kind of the scaling potential and those demand drivers for just a second. I think that there are some risks that I want to highlight with regards to biochar and broader CDR, just because it's in its, I think, early innings or nascency, even though it's been around for a while, but as a market, it is fairly nascent. And the risk that I see is that there's a high degree of concentration with regards to the buyers. There are basically, 10 very large buyers, maybe less, that dominate really large quotient of the CDR market globally, and then also specifically with regards to biochar. And as Abe said, those buyers have long-term plans to decarbonize. They're finding it increasingly difficult. They have a high internal carbon cost and are obviously looking to high integrity external sources to be able to achieve their targets in due course. And carbon credits in general can help them to achieve that, but they're going up that marginal abatement cost curve and looking for higher integrity units. And biochar again seems to be in this kind of Goldilocks zone. What we need, though, is greater and broader participation, right? So we need many, many more market actors. And I think that to the previous conversation around the demand driver coming from compliance, that certainly addresses that component. And then to Matthew's earlier point around sort of the decrease in trust, right? I won't say complete erosion, because I think that the integrity measures in the market have really gone to the heart of that problem and have really done a great job to address it. But we need to encourage more and more participation, both at, government to government levels. We need to see the emergence of Article 6 markets, and that be a key driver. Then we need to start to see more and more compliance systems adopt project-based approaches, and so break away from this pure voluntary kind of approach into systems where there's a duality. And I'll point to my home country now, Singapore, where we've got a carbon tax, and there is an allowable use of carbon credits in that system. Colombia's another market. Obviously, you've got the Australian market where ACCUs are allowable, or an instrument that's a key component of that policy measure. And then you need voluntary buyers to come in and help to incubate and sort of grow these markets. You need all of those efforts and to happen at scale. In order to mobilize the capital, however, the capital allocators are very risk averse, and they look at things through risk lenses. And so they need essentially to de-risk those projects. And Abe elucidated some aspects of really great project design that tends to attract those really great corporate buyers that have the good credit ratings that then can help to underwrite the project, and then the financiers can step in. In the absence of that, essentially, there's a lack of venture or equity-based capital that comes into a lot of these projects. They're very risky, and there's also a timing risk that is not yet factored in terms of the issuance pipelines. I will say that biochar is dominated by one standard, which is Pure Earth, which is fantastic, but Verra's obviously opened up a pathway there as well. Verra is not the most high throughput and high efficiency certification body out there. Let's just put it out there. And we need to also see holistic changes at the programmatic or the standard levels for the certification outcomes to emerge. And we need to rely on better systems, design, registries, but also digital monitoring, reporting, verification. So there's a lot of things that need to happen all at the same time for these markets to grow. And then the final thing that I'll add is because we have this dislocation in between voluntary markets and secondary markets, we need to start to see more of those transactions that are done on a primary basis to be continuously disclosed. And then as those projects start to scale, we hope to see more and more transactions in a secondary market. Why is that essential? Yes, it does sort of lead towards this kind of convergence, as Matthew said, towards a commoditization of the market, but that's not bad at all, because it allows to hedge risk and attracts other financial intermediaries to participate. But it actually helps the exchanges to effectively view what is the addressable supply, and then they can innovate and create the standardized instruments that then can beget those futures contracts and enable that hedging to occur. And without that, the hands are tied essentially at the exchanges, and they can't actually launch those contracts, or if they do, everything trades bilaterally. And so we kind of need to cross that chasm, but we've seen that happen before, and now the playbook's fairly well written, and you've got appetite from the big futures complexes at ICE and CME and here at SGX that are helping to sort of bridge that gap, and you see ABAX and other innovators in that space also emerging. So overall good stories, but there's still a lot of risk areas that we need to focus on in order to achieve scale in these markets. Hopefully we didn't waffle too long.
Maybe just pick up one thing that really resonated there, Renee, in terms of talking about participation. And in fact, I think the best metric for integrity is participation. Because if we have integrity and just no one uses these methods, there's no projects, like we are absolutely living in a fantasy world, and we are kidding ourselves that we're making any impact. So the best metric for integrity is participation. In order to drive up participation, as Abe said, we need a biochar method in the Australian context. In order to do that, though, we need to fix the process of methodology development under the ACCU market. Now, method development is something very close to my heart. My fun fact is I was the first private author of a methodology in Australia to get tentative determination, 2012. So I have an understanding of that process. I've been involved in many other method developments, including soil organic carbon, 2014, 2018, 2021. And unfortunately, we need to own up to the fact that the Chubb review, the implementation of the Chubb review that the Labor implemented just has not worked. The Australian carbon market methodology development process has stalled. So whoever wins the election, I think it's incumbent on all of us to then make that first order of business in terms of fixing that method development process, because there's too many good ideas that are there waiting to be implemented, and going nowhere. So that'd be the first thing. The second bit I'll just tack onto that, Adam, in terms of I think is then improving, getting the methodology in. But if we're talking about fixing the ACCU market, if we could make ACCUs actually exportable, so then not only doing primary trades within Australia, but then you could actually do secondary trading, that would advance a whole raft of price discovery and participation in Article 6, emerging markets. So we've got to fix up methodology development. Let's make those ACCUs exportable, because then that price will trek. So we don't need to anchor on the current ACCU price, but get some more price discovery in terms of that international context.
Adam, if I might just cut in for a minute, there's a question there to Matthew and myself from Louisa Kiley about the ACCU methodology for biochar at the moment. So I might just start with a comment, Matthew, and you might be able to add this because you do a lot more in this space. But my understanding of the current methodology for ACCUs is that you can make and use as much biochar as you like on soil in the same catchment. But if it's not made in the same catchment, you can only use 100 kilo per hectare. And also you need to claim the amount of carbon in the biochar. So you can't actually get a payback for the amount of carbon in the biochar. You can only get a payback for the priming effect of the biochar on the soil. So what that would do to increase the carbon on top of the carbon in the biochar. Is that, you want to comment on that, Matthew?
Yeah, no, that's that is correct. You only get the benefit of the priming effect. The plus side is it does make it neater to then add in potentially even under a framework, which I think the integrated farm land management methodology now reconfiguring itself as a framework methodology in terms of this is the scaffolding that you talk to different methodologies and how to use different parts of those methodologies for different contexts. So that does provide the architecture or the scaffolding to be able to claim that carbon. It does provide then the opportunity to get either in a module or a standalone methodology. Just then, here's the fixed carbon content of the biochar that's been manufactured. Obviously, if you're using it, proving that's been applied to land, there'll be a discussion with a landholder how all of that works out. But so those comments are correct in terms of its current usage. And then in terms of new method developments, it's kind of frustrating because I think the first draft biochar method was around 2014. And so there's a lot of these opportunities that aren't overly complicated that we've now got more than a decade of experience in running carbon farming projects. We should be able to resolve these issues far more quickly and speak to that building integrity through building participation and momentum.
Yeah. I mean, my understanding too is that, so obviously with ANZBIG developing this new, or supporting this new method too, will hopefully encompass some of that. But there is other markets like Carbon Pump who are members of ANZBIG that do allow you to account for the amount of carbon in the biochar. But if you're not accounting for it in the soil, you can sell it elsewhere on the voluntary market. So there's ways of selling it. It's just, it'd be nice to make it easier. And to answer Louisa's question about the availability of char, it is increasing, obviously, through projects like, what Biochar are doing. There is much more, and Metamorph Engineering, who I work for, we've got projects where we're creating larger quantities of biochar, and, our top of the projects in our pipeline, the top 20 or 30 are likely to produce around 100,000 tonnes of biochar in the next 5 years. But there's that's a conservative estimate. But KR project alone will produce that amount. So there's going to be more available. So we need to diversify these markets. And there's been some big questions about where biochar is used, but I can come back to that at the end.
Could I just make an important point about the ACCU method? As I understand it, you can apply more than 100 kilograms. Like, there's no limit. It's only that 100 kilograms will be equated as such. So you can use more, but it's only the 100 kilograms that's picked up.
Maybe I can bring it back to pricing, because I think it's a really good conversation. It lends itself to how does this all work? So Yes, you can apply biochar to soils under the AccuSoil methodology. If you apply more than 100, you have to net it off. That's what everyone's saying. So you can't count it in the calculation. That carbon you've added to the soil, at the moment, there's no methodology. But if you produce it, what the Accu method that's been put forward to the government was reviewed by ERAC and put forward to the minister, but the minister didn't have the resources at the current stage to deploy to it. And there were some other questions about how we account for the biochar within NGERs, and there's some great work being done by climate change. I think it's the CER and DECU and I think Climate Change Authority on that. But so you at the time of making the biochar, at that point you can claim the carbon for that durably stored biochar. You can then deploy that into the field, but you need to net off that carbon from the soil methodology. And as Matt referred to, there's like that stacking under the IFLM that seems like obvious that you could then deploy that. But what it's important about is, so what's the pricing then? So biochar has a price, and you can't talk about CDR pricing with biochar projects if you don't talk about the biochar price. So there's two ways to look at it. Either CDR is acting as is basically paying for the biochar use, or you could say the biochar price is reducing the value of the CDR. Either way, like you need both of them. So we would argue the agronomic benefit of biochar does not justify the cost of the production of that biochar, and therefore we need the CDR to make a project viable. Likewise, if we had the CDR buyer paying for the entire production marginal cost to remove of producing the biochar, it would be too expensive. So we would be probably up and above enhanced rock weathering. So we need both prices. We need a price on biochar. We need a price on the carbon removal. The carbon removal price has been relatively steady. I mean, you can look at the Puro index, which is provided by NASDAQ. I think CDR.FYI are doing a phenomenal job of providing data and transparency on pricing. You can have a look. But given the amount of volatility there has been in voluntary carbon markets more broadly, a beacon of just consistency has been the CDR pricing of biochar. It's up and slightly to the right corner. It's exactly what you want to see. There's certainly times of volatility, but I would say for lower technology solutions, I'm going to say 50 to 150. For engineered, it's like 150 to 250 is the pricing. There was some work done last year looking at what does a buyer want to pay, and I think they're in sort of like the 140s. What does a seller want to receive, and they're in sort of like the 185s as a general statement. In terms of the biochar pricing, that is really it's a broad range of pricing. So you can get it for free in some parts of the world, and you can pay up to $1,200. That $1,200, it might be inoculated, or it might be charged, it might be provided in a very specific type of form. And so it's a really broad range of pricing in the biochar. It's very nascent, and we're emerging. I would argue, and I think it was Renee made a comment on it, is like this is a really nascent industry. We're just getting going. And where there's most interest for me is like, what is the biochar worth? Like, what is a reasonable price to pay, and what will a farmer be willing to accept in terms of the value they get for deploying that? And we need that CDR stability while we work out that biochar price. And I think as we get more clarity on the biochar price around the world, we're going to get more clarity on that CDR price, and we're going to see more activity happening. One of the challenges, as Melissa was referring to, is, are there commercial quantities of biochar available? And I think, to Louisa, your question is like, where do I get this biochar from? And it's a bit of a chicken and egg, isn't it? So when we know the science is there, there's a lot of academic work on the veracity of providing biochar. We know the benefits on yields and microbial activity and cation exchange and all sorts of things about the benefits of biochar. But is biochar available in the market at a price point the farmer will pay? The CDR market is setting that up. So it's enabling us to invest in research, development, large-scale deployment, production, which then enables us to firm up the pricing on the biochar, which I think will then provide a bit more clarity. And as we get, as we move through the next sort of 5-10 years, we're going to see more and more deployment and more consistency on that pricing, I think.
Thanks, Abe. And just another follow-up question to you, because I know that you do at Biochar, you do arrange, biochar projects, and people come to you with potential ideas. There was a question from one of the attendees about making biochar from tea luds in Bangladesh. That's just one of many ideas that you could do in the world using biochar. There's probably 100 or 1,000 more. If someone came to you with an idea about making biochar in a particular country from a particular feedstock, what's sort of a minimum size of a project of making biochar before it could sort of enter the carbon market per se and attract carbon financing?
Look, I think look, there's lots of different size projects you can do, and you can go under CSI. There's isometric, there's Puro. There's lots of different ways you can run a project. Small is sometimes beautiful, and it's going to yield a great result. I think the work Vivek's doing in that aggregation model is pretty amazing. Look, we focus on large engineered solutions, so bigger is better for us. We see there's economies of scale there. We can bring down the marginal cost to remove. The buyers that we talk to prefer large scale projects for a variety of reasons. But there are challenges. You need a lot of capex. You need a lot of biomass. There's a lot of engineering. There's a lot of due diligence, but it can yield a slightly better result in terms of marginal cost to remove, we would argue. For us, like we look at bigger atoms, like from Biochar's perspective, if you've got a lot of biomass, we'd like to have a talk to you. We'd like to have a chat. But there's lots of different technologies, from the Kentucky tea lud, rotating drums, augers. There's lots of ways. The tea luds are really interesting. I'm sure you could do a project like that. There's some great work done over by Qualterra in USA doing tea luds, if they're interested to have a look. I know Greg Butler in our team has a lot of experience in that space as well. What we're seeing from the registries, and I refer to like the main ones for us are really Puro and isometric, although there are others, is they're looking for larger scale projects. So they're looking at 1,000 CDR as sort of a minimum to seek registration and issuance and auditing, and that's to help them cover their costs as well. So there is a sort of threshold forming in the market. So they're looking for slightly larger projects.
And also, just you mentioned Puro, and I'd like to just acknowledge Puro's leadership in the voluntary market since 2019, and really making it opportunities available to biochar projects to enter carbon markets. So they've definitely been one of the pioneers. And in preparation for this meeting, I went onto their website and saw how transparent they are with the information about what projects are available, how many carbon credits have been issued, and even who's buying the carbon credits. So all of that information is publicly available. It took me 10 minutes to make a little graph about the data that was coming in. A couple of fun facts out there is that the median annual increase in purchases of biochar carbon credits has been 136% over the last 5 years, year on year, and about total production of a little over 300,000 tons of CO2 has been removed from the atmosphere through the Puro system or platform. Another little thing about going first in being a pioneer or being an innovator, I helped to educate a particular biochar facility in Norway, a number of years ago. And, at that time, they didn't know who they were going to sell their biochar to, and yet found the investors to be able to make that happen. And I said to him, well, worst case, this stuff doesn't disappear for like 1,000 years. Just put it in a big bag and store it in the parking lot, right? And he pretty much did that. Like if you looked at his facility, he's got like hundreds of big bags of biochar, and then, build it and the customers will come, and the customers did come, and it's still going today, and it's doing quite well. So I think that's one thing which is a little bit overlooked with biochar, is that, this isn't a pile of mulch or leaves. This stuff stays around, even just as a physical storage of carbon. as long as you keep it wet. Yeah. So we'll move to some open questions that are coming in from attendees. There's a question from Patrick Quinn to Abraham. Do we have to pay farmers for both the feedstock and to use biochar on farm?
I think you should pay for the feedstock, in my opinion. I think it's not a waste. It's a valuable commodity. It's carbon, and I think we should be paying them for that. They've used their land to draw down carbon, and we want to lock it away. So in my opinion, there should be a value on the waste. If you get the opportunity to get a gate fee, so where someone pays you to take the waste, good on you. That's a cracker project. And so go for that. In terms of the biochar, I think they should pay for the biochar. That's a valuable commodity they're putting back into the land, and they're going to yield the benefit from that. I think we need to be working very closely with agronomists and landowners to monitor, educate, raise awareness, and study the impact of the biochar on their land so that we can help price it. And the way my team has sort of explained it to me, Frances Furlong's an agronomist who works for us over in Argentina, she put this concept in my head that a farmer should generate 2 to 3 times the value from an input into their field. So if they're getting a $600 return, and Stephen Joseph and Ansbig have done an amazing job putting together the farmer's playbook farmer's guide, where it provides some agronomic benefit. If they're getting a $600 benefit, then maybe they should pay 200. And that's how we think about it. So what is the benefit they're going to yield from using the biochar, and then what should they pay on the back of that? And I think that price discovery on the biochar is something I think we're going to have to keep working on as the years go by. And there'll be a competitive market and friction, and people productize. It's also, are you inoculating it? Are you using it as a carrier? Putting fertilizer or compost with it. So there's lots of different prices, but that's how I'd look at it. I'm not sure, I didn't pick up the name of the questioner, but pay for the waste, sell the biochar.
Okay. Interesting. We got a question here from Andrew Dougal. Can it be argued that charged biochar is a depreciating asset for a farmer? After the nutrients are used up, the biochar will still be there as capital. The nutrients will be exported off farm, so it will be worth less. Might make the numbers better if a farmer could depreciate it over time. Any comments?
Excellent idea. So soils are an asset. So like if you have an asset on your farm, that should be depreciated over time. And if you invest in that asset, you should be able to depreciate that capital works. So why not? We should be getting some accountant to come in and provide some standards on that. I mean, if that would make it more feasible, we should put that forward to someone. I think it's a great idea.
I'd just like to comment on that a little bit, Matthew might as well, is that those that are doing soil carbon projects as well, if you baseline your soil and you're increasing your soil carbon, and then the farm continues to get a payback, that is kind of willable onwards. Matthew, I think you probably could comment on that, yeah?
Willable, as in it continues with in terms of new landowners coming on board.
Yeah, willable and sellable, so it increases the value of your farm when you sell it as well. If you're
absolutely. And in fact, I think that's one of the benefits in all these types of initiatives is that a better set of documentation and paper trail accompanying sale of property, so that you're not just doing straight market comps in terms of farmable area of land. You're just saying, well, hold on, here was the actual baseline at a point in time, and here's how it's been improving over time. So it's a much more richer understanding of the land, and all of those benefits do accrue and transfer with title.
Regarding the topic of depreciating asset, another stimulating factor with the use of biochar, and in fact soil carbon in general, is the fact that in Australia, last 10 years, the price of agricultural land has pretty much doubled. So farmer is posed with the new question, whether to go and buy additional holdings and expand their farm, or to invest in making the soil that they already have better. So obviously, when the price of agricultural land doubles, and we've seen actually this around the world, that there's been this ballooning of assets, and it's come into agricultural land as well. There's more incentive now to invest in soil quality and soil improvement than there was 10 years ago, which is an additional stimulation, I guess, for products such as biochar, which have a long-term soil improving effect. So we're getting towards.
Maybe Adam,
yeah.
just on that, because I think
Yeah.
something that again is sort of common knowledge, but not necessarily common practice, is when it comes to land, even rating effective rainfall. So then that speaks to, you've got an area of land. If you want to double productivity, do you buy the same amount of land, or do you improve the actual condition of your land? So speaking to one of the characteristics around increasing soil organic carbon, or one of the value adds from applying biochar, is increasing rainfall retention, because it's not the amount of rain that falls on a farm that's important, it's the amount that's retained for beneficial use. So that's something where people intuitively know that, but what we don't have yet is that sort of standardized metric, so that if you're in 750 mil rainfall, but you're only capturing half of that rain, well, you're really living in 375 mil, effective rainfall country. So it becomes a useful accounting metric. We talked before about accounting metrics in terms of what's the value proposition from increasing the rainfall retention on your land. Now, a plug for AgriProof, we've been playing around with actually digitizing that. So as a digital tool, being able to rate what your farm was and look back in the past in terms of how much rainfall you're actually capturing, and then how management is having an impact on that effective rainfall in terms of how much rain that you capture. So you do need rain to grow things. So the more rain you can actually capture and put to use on a farm does speak to that increasing productivity. Then increasing productivity, you increase 20% more production is same as buying another 200 hectares of land if you're on 1,000 hectare of land, and that's got real tangible fundamental value. So to be able to speak to the value add beyond just that initial application or return, but the value add from that long-term capital perspective, I think becomes really important to introduce into our common vernacular.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, for that insight. I think as we're going towards the end of our webinar now, we'll just cross to our four panelists, our three remaining panelists, and just get some final comments. Renee, can we have any final comments from you? Any thoughts that this has brought up throughout this conversation?
Yeah, I think that there's huge potential with regards to biochar, right? And Abe obviously mentioned also this kind of constraints with regards to feedstocks, but undoubtedly there will be significant increase in demand for CDR, like high integrity CDR, pure and simple, and biochar will remain the dominant quotient within the market. We do, and we've discussed this ad nauseum, really clear policy signals and drivers to incentivize further and further investment in the origination and development of more of this supply, so we can have a stronger pipeline. And we do need the market to just evolve naturally, and that'll happen as we start to get a shift of, not purely dependent on primary supply and not purely dependent on a very select group of corporates that are currently buying, but as we get broader participation and then we start to get distribution around those price signals, we'll see the market evolve. And I do think that there's significant potential. It is one of the trusted pathways for carbon removals under the UNFCCC, and we do expect that biochar has really long legs.
Great, thanks for your comments, Renee, and your involvement in the webinar today. Vivek, can we get some final comments from you and any inspiration from India? What can we expect from your projects in India in the coming years, or what's your big ambitions?
I don't know whether big or small, or I think as a company we always we have a very simple view. We are in the business of climate change. So are we taking any steps in improving that? And if we are, then then we are in the right direction. So that's fundamentally, that's where we start. And I think I would encourage people who are in this sector to, to look at projects from that perspective. And then I think all the other things, they fall into place, because you have decided your direction, and it's in line with the business that you have established or the business you are in. So I think even as a sector, we often kind of get swayed away, with different outcomes, which is good. But I think biochar is a great CDR or removals outcome. I think there is a need for that in the world. Waste is available in all quantities everywhere. India is again a big producer of this ag waste. So yeah, so I think if more people should look into it with a view that how they can actually solve this problem of waste, and I think they will definitely get a positive commercial outcome in time to come.
Thank you very much, Vivek, for your participation and interesting insights into your work and to Biochar. Abe, do we have any last comments from you, and can you give us some inspiration to take away with us?
Yeah, I don't know about inspiration, but I would say that all boats rise in an emerging industry like this. So all of you who are interested in developing projects, buying credits, working together is really important. I think the Acu Biochar method was one of the best experiences I've had in my professional life, working with, I think, nearly 40 different groups and stakeholders. And so please collaborate, please engage with ANZBIG or IBI or wherever that is. I would say if you're looking at voluntary versus compliance, compliance is easy to finance, but it's a lower price. It's a commoditized credit. In the voluntary, think about project design. So you're trying to de-risk and sell a very good narrative to a buyer. And so you probably have to think more holistically about where your project fits and how you position that. You're most likely getting an offtake to finance the balance sheet, as Renee said. So you want a strong buyer to access capital on the back of that offtake, as opposed to in the compliance market, where you can probably finance the future delivery of the credits. And that's the sort of like, that's how I draw the distinction of those two. We will be active in voluntary and we'll be active in compliance. We're not saying one is better than the other. Other than that, just the last one I would say is just the role of ratings. I just didn't come up, and I think it's emerging. So we mentioned idiosyncratic risks. So what we're saying there is like each project is unique and has its own, highlights, its own risks, its own stakeholders. What are ratings agencies? And I think they do. So B0, Silvera, and I think there's Calix and Trove are doing it, but B0 and Silvera seem to be the most dominant at the moment. They provide a sort of a layer of quality or a standard that provides some sort of standardization or pricing sort of metric for buyers. So if you're at that early stages, have a look at an ex ante rating. I think they're referring to it. So a pre-project rating or an ex-post rating once you've issued credits. That's one way to sort of increase that narrative. That was probably the last thing I wanted to add in, Adam. And then if I can just, we are about to submit a letter to aspiring politicians. If people would like to contribute, please reach out to ANZBIG and we'll get you added on, because I do think if the industry works together and if we tell politicians at the right time that this industry is coming and all the benefits from it, and we raise their awareness, I think it's inevitable that biochar will see its place.
Great. Thanks very much for your great thoughts there, Abraham, and participation today, all the way from Japan, I believe. If the panelists, I'm going to hand it back to our ANZBIG chair, Melissa. And if there's just a few outstanding questions there, if the panelists have the ability to answer some of those, that would be great. There's a couple of specific ones, for example, for Vivek. And in the meantime, I'll hand back to Melissa for closing comments. Thank you, Melissa.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I've been busily answering questions in the background from our attendees, and thank you to all of those questions. So a lot of the questions were around, well, where's the biochar markets? And I see them, my comments were, and feel free, panelists, for any other comments on these when I'll just touch on a few of the questions, you can comment. So the biochar markets are growing, I think, and the industry, the message is the industry isn't boutique anymore. It's not just, backyard kilns that are producing it, which is a viable market for biochar that have their own markets, but there's also larger scale biochar available from these industrial kilns that can produce consistent made to order biochar. And technologies can alter the temperature and speed at which that biochar is made, and so can really make fit for purpose chars. So that's the message, I think. The markets really depend on the producer, I suppose. So, there's quite a few comments about fertilizer industry using biochar. The fertilizer industry would be better off making it themselves. It's going to be better and cheaper for them to make it and use it combined with their current synthetics to make them go further. That's slow on the uptake, but I see that there are emerging markets that are actually looking at making their own fit for purpose fit-for-purpose biochar fertilizers. But also there's the opportunity to sell them to resellers that could combine with synthetic fert. Yes, fertilizer companies aren't going to market to use biochar with their fertilizer, but resellers and the farmers will drive that adoption because they want to, reduce their fertilizer uses. Globally, that's the biggest use of biochar at the moment is in cereals from the IBI-UBI report, is in cereal production and with synthetic fert, but the emerging markets that are adopting it faster are the industrial industries that want larger scale takeoffs. So I think there's lots of opportunities to look at the markets. There's a range of questions I think we covered off on with calculations of a biochar. But I think what's really important to reiterate is that we have a standard in Australia New Zealand Biochar Industry Group. We're working with Standards Australia to formalise that, and those standards are about making biochar for soil, industrial and feed grade, but there'll also be standards in how it's made as well. That's really important. There's EPA issues right across the country that we've tackled and I think covered off on a lot of them via ANSBIG that are working on. And then also, as Abe said, the ACCU methodology, ANSBIG's working on that, which will diversify markets, and us, our panelists have covered up on that. I think most of the methodologies at the moment, as far as I'm aware, you don't get your payment until you can show where the biochar is used as well. So it's really important to show where that is going to be used or be used, and then it's audited. So I think, there's a lot of standards in how this works. It's highly measurable, but it's, I think that's the great thing about biochar. You can measure the carbon in the char and you can measure where it's used. And it's, so there's just a few comments I made from, just to give a bit more detail around the Q&A. I don't know if anyone wanted to make any other comments around that.
Probably running out of time now, Melissa, but I'll hand over probably to Don, our CEO, to finish off the webinar. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to every question that was asked, but we'll do our best to write some of the answers there.
I think feel free to email us at chair@ansbig.org or exec@ansbig.org, and we can divert the question to the right person as well.
Okay, if you could put that email in the chat there to everyone, Melissa,
I don't know if
because
I can
there were
type
a
it
few
into
people.
the Q&A. I don't know how to.
Yeah, I think you can just do it to everyone as well in the chat as well.
Oh, I can. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Adam, for facilitating today. Excellent job. Adam chairs our Standards and Certification Working Group. They meet once a month. Anyone can join and observe for at least a couple of meetings, and then we just ask that you join ANSBIG after that. So I think we just had a meeting yesterday. So yeah, if you'd like to join, please get in touch. Yeah, you can go to our contact page at ansbig.org, and Melissa, myself, and our cluster manager, Sam Sagami's contact details are there. Also, Melissa, thanks for your presence and expert comments and answers in the Q&A. And thank you to all our excellent speakers. I felt it was a great discussion. And everyone who joined us live, or are tuning in via the YouTube recording or the Biochar podcast by Ansbig on Spotify, which will be released early next week. So the carbon industry are an important partner in the biochar value add chain that I think we've affirmed today. And when we link that chain, the investment will flow. Please check out our product and services directory under our resources tab from our members. If you're looking for feedstock, pre or post processing equipment, the biochar tech itself, or a producer that you can sell your some, it's all in there. So yeah, really great resource. Also, this webinar and podcast is part of the Road to Biochar Expo 2025, taking place June 25 to 26 at Southern Cross University on the Gold Coast. So it's right next to the International Coolangatta Airport. We've received over 55 abstracts across all major themes, from carbon finance and biochar standards to agri-tech, innovation and infrastructure. We are now sorting through all of these to come up with what will be a magnificent program and highlighting the amount of activity that's going on in the sector. Under the policy, standards, certification and market development theme, we will have presentations from the team at Biochar. You've got about 5 presentations there, Abe, so lots happening. Also, Puro Earth, who you mentioned, Adam, who have led the way in this in carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets. They'll speak to rewarding carbon dioxide removal. We've got the Department of Tourism, Science and Innovation, Queensland, DESTI, talking to the new end of waste code for biochar in Queensland, which is super important for trading biochar as a commodity, as well as Standards Australia on standards and its role in the industry growth. Also, we will be talking to the ongoing Biochar ACU Method Initiative that you touched on, Abe, and you were integral in that process, and how we are engaging the Australian government to include a biochar method in our compliance market, which, along with major government investment, such as the 1.35 billion euro one by the Danish government into biochar, is really what will be required to reach net zero in time, according to the science. So we'll be announcing the full program before May 23, and early bird registrations are now open to that date. So visit anzbc.org.au. You can book your accommodation. We've got booking discounts at 3 options in Coolangatta. And on the middle evening, we will be holding our networking dinner and awards ceremony. So a friendly reminder to nominate someone who is making a difference in this space at ansbig.org. It's going to be our biggest event yet, and we'd love to see you there. And real outcomes do happen at the Biochar Expo. If today's session sparked your interest, please share the recording, follow Ansbig online, and help spread the word about biochar's powerful role in climate solutions. We'll see you next month on Thursday, May 28 at the same time for the final in this series entitled Enabling Biochar Policy Frameworks in a Circular Economy World, and at Biochar Expo 2025. So, Charles from the team at Ansbig.